What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel.
So stories like Captain America Sam Wilson Volume 2, the Civil War II tie-in, this is where my bread gets buttered. I mean, I love stories like this so much because some writers are really good at this. Nick Spencer does a really good job of drawing like these parallels, these dichotomies, with taking these concepts, past and present, both real world and fictional, putting them together and creating a very cohesive story. Now, keep in mind, for those of you guys who are just now joining us, joining my channel with regards to all new, all different Marvel, the idea of, Captain America Sam Wilson was kind of continuing these themes from before the events of Secret Wars. That is to say, Steve Rogers basically lost his super soldier serum. Maybe we should talk about that at some point along the line, but Steve Rogers lost his super serum. The result was that he aged pretty rapidly, and he basically passed the mantle of Captain America on to Sam Wilson. It was the next logical step to take. And it was really the early stages of Marvel kind of moving into the realm of diversity. And much like the introduction of Kamala Khan, much like the introduction of Riri Williams sort of replacing Tony Stark as Iron Man, it was met with a lot of divisive positions. People who were really irritated at the idea that Steve Rogers wasn't going to be Captain America. Now, this kind of begs a really good question about the idea of diversity in comics. I don't want to get too preachy here, but for the most part, something that I want to clarify here is that with the notion of diversity, I agree very much with Comic Historian and the idea that diversity is kind of being pushed too hard too fast. It's not the idea that older and traditional comic book fans are against diversity. It's the idea that they're against forced diversity. The notion that if you want to read Iron Man, you have to read Riri Williams. You can't read Riri and Tony Stark. Really, they'd probably pick both, to be quite frank. They'd probably read both of them. They'd give Riri Williams a couple volumes to see how she does, and then they'd probably go back to Tony Stark if they don't care for what Brian Michael Bendis has to offer. And so that's really kind of the stance. That's really where a lot of people are coming from when they oppose the notion of diversity. But again, because of the fact that, Sam Wilson sort of has his own story going on here with Nick Spencer, who's doing an extremely good job, this all comes out of Volume 1. Now, keep in mind, in Volume 1, we saw some things going on with his ranks being bolstered. That is to say, him getting his own supporting cast. We saw Misty Knight, who, of course, really found her biggest claim to fame as sort of this relaunch, I guess volume 3 or 4 of Heroes for Hire during the original Civil War, but she had long since been part of the superhero community as this information broker. Her being part of Sam Wilson's landscape really maintains this theme that Nick Spencer is going for, that Sam Wilson is far more of a grounded Captain America in the sense that Steve Rogers only ever really dealt with like planetary threats. Sam Wilson deals with what's going on here on the ground, the average person dealing with struggles, and how Sam Wilson can help to alleviate that. We also saw the introduction of D-Man, Demolition Man. Why he was rolled in, I don't know, but Nick Spencer did a good job of taking a pretty irrelevant character and making him interesting, making him kind of fun. Of course, Demolition Man being a guy that has super strength, agility, different things like that. He was designed to be a kind of spin-off of Wolverine minus the adamantium, and it created a really cool, circumstance for like 5 issues, and then he just stopped being important after that. But maintaining this theme of Sam Wilson being a very grounded character, Nick Spencer really kind of draws on the fan perception of Sam Wilson, because keep in mind, not everybody's against him, in terms of the fan base, but a lot of people are very traditional Captain America fans, in the sense that Steve Rogers is Captain America, he's always been Captain America, he should be the only one to be Captain America. And this makes sense to a degree. Steve Rogers is like one of those untouchables, when it comes to Marvel Comics. Like, you can change a lot of different people, but he's the guy you don't change. He's the guy you don't adjust. A lot of people feel that way. It would be like getting rid of Peter Parker and replacing him with somebody else, which Marvel did for a time with the Clone Saga. We got all different kinds of characters. We got, all these different versions of Peter Parker, or at least these clones of Peter Parker. We've had different iterations of Spider-Man over the years. Miguel O'Hara, Kane, Ben Reilly, all these different guys who took these different versions of Spider-Man and kind of made it their own. But in the end, it was always Peter Parker who was the Spider-Man. This is also kind of contrasted by the fact that we have Peter Parker Spider-Man, but we also have Miles Morales. That's why you don't hear a lot of people complaining about Peter Parker and Miles, because they get both. But for Sam Wilson, his whole position is a lot more grounded in the sense that there's been this giant movement, this influx of people out there who reflect, traditional Steve Rogers fans in the sense that they don't like Sam Wilson. They basically say, he's not my Captain America. Steve Rogers is Captain America. Now, in a lot of ways, the people, the average citizenry within Marvel Comics are kind of letting things slide just because of the fact that Steve Rogers was old. He couldn't actually be Captain America. But following the events of Avengers Standoff, when S.H.I.E.L.D. basically recreated the Cosmic Cube, and then Red Skull got a hold of the Cosmic Cube and used it to modify reality and change the history of Steve Rogers so that he was a Hydra agent, when his youth was restored, people said, okay, Steve Rogers is young again. Your tenure was cool, Sam Wilson. It's been real. It's been real, and it's been good, but it ain't been real good. It's time for you to give the mantle back to Steve Rogers. Because of that, a lot of people are saying, it's done. He needs to be finished. Now, three main characters that will be in the background here are Paul Kane, who's basically, an industrialist. He's a corporate guy. We have Senator Tom Harold, and then we have another guy named Harry Hauser, I think it is. And Hauser is more or less like an allegory for Rush Limbaugh, spewing vitriol, anger, rage, different things like that. Tom Harold is just a politician from Texas who's basically manipulating things for his own goal. And then Paul Kane's doing the exact same thing. Now, what we essentially learn is that between these three guys, they've essentially launched something called the Americops. And the Americops are really Nick Spencer's way of drawing this parallel, making this juxtaposition between the 1960s civil rights movement and what's happening right now. Now, in terms of why he chose to make this a main storyline, I'm not entirely sure. I imagine a lot of the emphasis here could have just simply been put on Sam Wilson as a character and how he deals with, people telling him not to be Captain America. But before we start to get into that, we basically pick up with the death of James Rhodes, because remember, James Rhodes died during Civil War II. The crux of the story, as Bendis had written it, was that there was some inhuman named Ulysses who claimed to be able to see the future. He was able to predict a couple of events, like a handful of events here and there. And because of that, Carol Danvers took it as absolute truth with no evidence that it was actually true. Tony Stark said, we have to look at this from a scientific standpoint and verify whether or not it's true. And it created a rift in the superhero community. During this time, Ulysses had made a prediction that Thanos was going to return to Earth. He was correct. And this resulted in Carol Danvers grabbing James Rhodes, along with a handful of other superheroes, taking them off to fight Thanos. James Rhodes was killed and She-Hulk was beaten to a coma. And so because of this, we have what's basically a gathering of the most prominent Black superheroes right now. Of course, Misty Knight, Black Panther, Luke Cage, Storm, Brother Voodoo, Nick Fury Jr., and Monica Rambeau. The cool thing about this, though, is that Sam Wilson's told this is kind of like the gathering for James Rhodes. It's us. He was an African-American. We're the most prominent African-Americans. We're here to basically mourn our friend. But the other question is, who's going to speak his eulogy? And of course, they all basically say, of course you're going to do it, Sam Wilson. Now, this is not simply because it's Sam Wilson, because it's like, well, I mean, you're Sam Wilson. There's nothing really special about Sam Wilson himself. And even he says that. He's like, I didn't know James Rhodes. We weren't friends. I didn't know him that well. I fought alongside him, but, we hung out once in a while, but it's not like we were friends like he and Carol Danvers were friends, or James Rhodes and Tony Stark were friends. It wasn't like that. He says he's just a guy that I knew. They say, you're the one that needs to deliver the eulogy because you're Captain America. You have to get up there and speak. And so because of this, Sam Wilson gets up and makes this really, really impassioned speech, and it's beautifully done the way it's written. It's really just him saying, look, we're at a precipice here. We are at a time where the country is just as polarized as it was during the Civil War. Because of this, there are people on all sides. There are people that think that I shouldn't be Captain America. There are people that think that individuals of color should be patrolled. It's a very, controversial statement to make, but it's really him basically saying the superhero community has a rift, society has a rift, the country is basically being split down the middle. And so for him, he sits down and he says, what we need is a coming together. What we need is people recognizing what they share in common instead of, splitting themselves by what makes them different. And so because of this, we kind of transition back to the Americops. Now again, this is really Nick Spencer kind of looking to the 1960s civil rights movement. The issue that I have with Nick Spencer doing this is he paints a very black and white picture. The civil rights movement was anything but black and white. It was not clear cut. There are people who will tell you the civil rights movement was only Black Americans marching for black rights and they were fighting off white cops. Anybody who tells you that is wrong. They're wrong in the worst way possible. The civil rights movement was about human rights. There were facets of it that really focus only on Black Americans, but as a whole, if you go and look at the message of Martin Luther King, you go and look at the message, of Claudette Colvin, of all these different people who were part of the civil rights movement, they'll say it was human rights. It was African Americans, white Americans, Hispanic Americans, people from the Far East, from Asia, people who all felt disenfranchised in some form or fashion, marching together for human rights. They were marching against white cops. They were marching against black cops. They were marching against anybody who they had felt disenfranchised them. And so because of that, it was a melting pot of cultures. What Nick Spencer does here is he paints a really skewed perspective and simply saying that, well, we have the black community that's being oppressed by these Americops, which are basically the equivalent of white cops in the civil rights movement. I don't really care for that because it really skews how good this story could be. But be that as it may, one of the issues for Sam Wilson is looking around and seeing what's going on. Now, at this point, of course, we're kind of told about Paul Kane. We're given a little bit of information here. I mean, really what we have so far isn't that big. It's not, we don't really need much more than that in the sense that Paul Kane is just an industrialist. He's essentially the one that kind of launched this campaign for Americops in the first place. Tom Harold, being a senator from Texas, is the one that passed legislation in Congress that requires the Justice Department to work alongside and fund the Americops throughout all 50 states. And Harry Hauser is the one who's basically telling people the Americops are good for you, and what they're doing is getting rid of the undesirables, quote unquote. Now, this is where Nick Spencer really starts to get into this cool situation when he's talking about Carol Danvers versus Iron Man, because for Sam Wilson, he's fighting alongside both these guys, but it's in different situations. He's fighting alongside Tony Stark in one situation, fighting alongside Carol Danvers in another situation. These two characters represent starkly opposing dichotomies in the sense that Tony Stark is very inhuman when it comes to his perspective. He says, yeah, sure, Ulysses may be able to see the future, or at least he claims to. We need to look at the science of it. We need to focus only on the science and know how his brain works, how his powers work, and then go from there. You know, he's thinking logically. Carol Danvers is thinking emotionally. No, he says he can see the future. He saved us. He hasn't been wrong up to this point. His powers are 100% perfect. Both of these characters are wrong because they're taking extremes. And that's what Nick Spencer is saying, is that it's extreme view. That's why I say the Civil War II tie-in has a lot of symbolism in the sense that we could take, you know, the Americops versus Black communities. We could take Carol Danvers versus Tony Stark, and they're just overlays. One replaces the other. They all pretty much amount to the same thing. They're extreme views. And in the middle of this is Sam Wilson trying to be the voice of reason, because what he does is he goes to Tony Stark and says, hey, look, man, you can't look at this strictly, you know, by way of science. Yeah, people are irrational sometimes. A person will sit down and say, I really need to clean my house today, and then play video games all day long. I mean, it's just, I do that. I do that all the time. But nonetheless, you know, people are contradictory. People are hypocritical, but it's what makes us who we are, and it's what gives us the reason to grow, the desire to become something better. At the same time, he tells Carol Danvers, you can't approach this strictly from an emotional perspective, because what happens if you do, and then one day Ulysses is wrong? It could lead to a catastrophic war. It could lead to terrible events. And so it's him just really kind of trying to gain the middle ground, trying to understand what exactly is going on. Now, at this point, we kind of switch back to reality here. We kind of jump back to what's going on right now with regards to these Americops and a lot of these Black communities that Nick Spencer is giving us. And what he says is that amidst these Black communities, in response to the Americops, is basically rage. This character, really, you know, Elvin Halliday, who's really just like a Black Incredible Hulk. I hate to say it that way, but that's what he was made to be. He was a young kid who was doused with some toxins. You know, it increased his size. It basically made him look like a massive adult who's 8 feet tall, but he gets stronger the angrier he gets. So he's basically the Incredible Hulk without, you know, the green skin. And I don't believe his strength is unlimited. But the issue here is that Nick Spencer is basically, you know, providing the scenario by saying that rage could represent any number of people. Rage might represent Malcolm X. It really seems like rage is representing Nick Spencer's perception of the Black Panther Party. And if that's correct, then he couldn't be further from the truth on this either. The Black Panther Party was not some wildly insane hate group. If you go, you know, listen to the lectures of like Bobby Seale, for example, one of the founders alongside P. Newton with regards to the Black Panther Party, like if you listen to him talk, he'll tell you the Black Panther Party right now does not share the ideals of the original 1960s Black Panther Party. Why? Because back during the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Panther Party then was a humanitarian group. There were a few people here and there who were outliers, who were extremists, but if you go and look at the kind of things they did, they had neighborhood initiatives. You know, they taught people about their constitutional rights, not just gun control, but about their constitutional rights, free speech, the ability to take the Fifth Amendment so you don't incriminate yourself when you're put on trial. They had initiatives to feed people who otherwise couldn't feed themselves. They gave education to people beyond the grade school education they were getting in school. It was a huge humanitarian effort on behalf of the Black Panther Party in order to ensure equal rights and kind of, you know, this increase in status for African Americans at the time. That's the best word I know, you know, for lack of a better word, status is the best one that I know how to use. But instead, what we get here with the character of Rage is him basically instigating violence. Now, in truth, this is really kind of Nick Spencer building on the character of Rage in the sense that he was always a hothead. When he was part of the New Warriors, he was a hothead. When he was part of the Avengers, he was a hothead. It was always this way. But this is also Nick Spencer saying that violence is not necessarily the answer to everything. It is a answer, and violence is a very effective answer, but it is not always the answer. And the reason why is because all it's going to do is make things worse. Case in point, we switch over to some classified location. This location is totally irrelevant, but the reason why we switch over there is because we're basically picking up with John Walker, also known as U.S. Agent. Now, U.S. Agent, as far as I'm aware, was a Mark Grunwald creation back in the 1980s, I think it was, and he was designed to be kind of a replacement for Steve Rogers to see whether or not people would be receptive to Steve Rogers kind of moving away from the role of Captain America and somebody else stepping into his place. It was kind of this question of, in the 1980s, following, you know, the death of Gwen Stacy, following The Dark Knight Returns, is it time to kind of move away from this lighter fare of comics and start moving into a much darker tone? And And so John Walker was a very dark Captain America, and his whole idea was that he basically stood for what he considered to be the true values of the United States. You know, Steve Rogers stood for the idealistic United States, that people will always do the right thing and people will always make the right decision. I have trust in the American people. John Walker was a Captain America that said, no. There are some people in this country who are just bad. Those people need to be put down. And that's why he was so extreme, because he killed people as Captain America. I mean, he didn't kill a lot, but he made mistakes, and he did kill people as Captain America. And so because of this, we essentially have John Walker being brought to Lower Manhattan and meeting with Tom Harreld, meeting with Paul Kane, you know, these guys who are spearheading the Americops thing. And what they basically say is, look, Sam Wilson represents change. It's not really a situation like it's not really Nick Spencer saying Sam Wilson represents a black man being successful and we can't have that. No. What he's saying is that Sam Wilson represents change. Sam Wilson represents the idea that America is far more diverse than we would like it to be. What they're saying is that Sam Wilson represents the notion that there's someone who is challenging the status quo. You know, when it was Captain America Steve Rogers, he was focused on, you know, the world being saved. Sam Wilson's focusing on the ground level. And when you're focusing on the ground level, things like corrupt corporations catch your eye. Things like politicians who are engaging in some really seedy tactics catch your eye. And so what it means is that Sam Wilson would make it his mission to bring down guys like Tom Harreld, to bring down guys like Paul Kane. And so they really view him as a challenge to their dominance of whatever their goals and ambitions happen to be. Because of this, what they do, or at least what they're intending to do, is they're basically contracting John Walker to take out Sam Wilson. Now, John Walker's response to this is no. But it's not because he believes in Sam Wilson. It's not because he even likes Sam Wilson. He doesn't really like him at all. What he says is Steve Rogers is the only man that needs to be Captain America. He's the man that I respect the most. But if Steve Rogers handed his mantle over to Sam Wilson and said, Sam Wilson is now Captain America, then that means that Sam Wilson is now Captain America. Get over it. And so the whole situation is kind of left ambiguous for a little bit, but then we basically kind of like transition back over to Sam Wilson. And the issue he's running into is that, you know, standing up to Rage and basically saying, hey, look, man, you cannot fight these Americops like this. All you're going to do is make things worse. There's got to be a way to work around this. We can take down the guys who are running it. We can open people's eyes up to the idea that things are extreme. It's really kind of like this Martin Luther King perception versus the Malcolm X perception. Which one wins out on top? Now, in this day and age, I imagine a lot of people, it'll probably hit a lot of nerves, and a lot of people will say, hey, look, sometimes the only thing you can ever really do with people who share this kind of ideal is just eliminate them. No second chances. You know, that's an extreme perspective. But what Sam Wilson is also saying here is, look, man, there is a way to fight this problem. But if you fight it like this, if you use your fists, if you use your hands, you know, if you start pummeling these Americops, all you're going to do is show the country or tell the country that you are out of control. They're not going to say Rage is out of control. They're going to say, see, look, the black community is out of control. And so because of that, it'll make things even worse. And it'll make things a whole lot easier for the Americops to really achieve even more control than they had before, making life even more of a nightmare. This is why I say this comic's really, you know, controversial, because Nick Spencer's drawing in a lot of these racial issues. It is kind of preachy, but I do really love comics like this. So ultimately, with the arrival of John Walker, who's essentially agreed to the terms of Paul Kane and Tom Harreld, it's really him versus Sam Wilson. Now, one of the things that goes on here is Sam Wilson basically says, look, you know, for him, it's not even the glitz and glamour anymore. It's not worrying about the presses. It's not worrying about the cameras. It's none of that stuff. It's this idea that John Walker could legitimately take him out. Because remember, John Walker got his powers, I think, from the power broker, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a guy that brokers powers. I think that was the case, although I'm not going to swear to that. But he has strength, speed, agility, all that kind of stuff. He was able to go toe to toe with Steve Rogers. Sam Wilson's just a really athletic guy with some cool gadgets and stuff. And so for him, it's not a fist, you know, it's not a hand-to-hand fight. It's him gaining the upper hand as best he can. And so again, because he can form these psychic links with birds, he literally just takes John Walker into a dark tunnel, uses the eyesight provided by these birds that, you know, of course, can see in the dark, and then just beats the hell out of John Walker. It's quick, fast, and to the point. I mean, there's no great big huge drawn out thing, and there doesn't have to be. But something John Walker tells him is, you act like you know everything. You don't know nearly as much as you think you do. And so what we do here is we transition over to this meeting that John Walker was having with Tom Harreld and Paul Kane. And as he was talking to them, again, he just kept turning him down. No. I'm not going to go out there. I'm not going to fight Sam Wilson. Captain America, Steve Rogers, made him Captain America. I respect Steve Rogers. I'm not going to challenge Sam Wilson. Well, then because of the fact that he's so adamant about refusing to do so, Steve Rogers makes his appearance. Now, keep in mind, Steve Rogers is a Hydra agent because the Cosmic Cube was used to change his history. And so what he does is he comes to John Walker and says, look, when I moved moved Sam Wilson into the position of being Captain America, I thought he shared my ideas. I thought he saw the world in the same way I did. It's obvious he doesn't. He's not fit to hold the mantle of Captain America anymore. But what he says is, if I go out there, if I, as a white guy, go out there and beat up a black guy as Captain America and take his shield from him, what it's going to tell the black community in the country is that black people need to know their place, that the white guy is always on top. And so he says it's going to create a huge rift. It's going to create a level of division that we can't handle. Now, here's the irony of all this, and this is why I say John Walker's not the sharpest tool in the shed. It doesn't matter if it's John Walker, it doesn't matter if it's Steve Rogers. Well, it might matter a little bit more if it's Steve Rogers, but the role is still the same. John Walker is a white guy going out there beating up a black guy and saying, know your place. It's this crazy situation because remember, Steve Rogers as a Hydra agent is wanting to take over the country. Like, he's wanting to bring the country crashing down. I mean, his motivations are still being fleshed out, but he's not doing this because he genuinely believes that Sam Wilson has lost his way. He's not doing this because he genuinely believes that Sam Wilson doesn't share his ideals anymore. He's doing this because of the division that it will create. He's doing this because of the fact that people will look at John Walker and say, wow, we have a white guy beating up a black guy and saying the black guy just can't get ahead. Right, wrong, or otherwise, that's the perception they will take. And because of that, it'll make things all the easier. Steve Rogers is very much playing the Napoleon Bonaparte role. If you want to conquer a country, you don't take on a unified country, you take on a fractured country. You go in, you start civil war, you wait until the country's at its weakest, and then you conquer it. Because it's easy to conquer a divided territory than a united territory. And so because of that, the last thing he says to John Walker before this comment comes to an end is he basically says, look, no one can know that I put you up to this. If anybody finds out that I put you up to this, it'll cause division problems. If Sam Wilson finds out that I put you up to this, it'll crush him. It'll be like he will walk away from the mantle. Now again, this is the face that Steve Rogers is putting on. Steve Rogers is putting on his, oh yeah, I'm Captain America, I'm a good guy face. That's what he's doing with John Walker. John Walker doesn't see Steve Rogers, the Hydra agent. He sees Steve Rogers, Captain America, the man that he's always respected. And Steve Rogers is playing on this. That's why I say Rogers is such a great Hydra agent, because it's the guy you never expect. It's the dagger in the heart from the person that you never saw coming. It's amazing the way this is done. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explain, you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.